Welcome to the Bullvine Podcast, where we bring you the most fascinating stories from the world of dairy farming and cattle breeding. I'm Bella, joined as always by my co-host Douglas. Today, we're diving into what might be the single most influential story in Holstein breeding history, the tale of Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief, a bull whose genetics fundamentally reshaped global dairy production.
That's right, Bella. We're talking about what I consider the $4,300 gamble that transformed dairy farming forever. This is truly a remarkable story about how one bull's genes completely rewrote what was possible for milk production. Over the next hour, we'll trace Chief's journey from birth to his unprecedented genetic legacy, explore the breeder who made it all possible, and discuss the lessons modern breeders can learn from this fascinating chapter in dairy history.
I understand Chief's genetic influence on today's Holstein population is absolutely staggering. Is that right, Douglas?
Absolutely. According to the 2020 pedigree analysis of Holstein sires, Chief's genetic contribution is estimated at 14.95% of the current Holstein genome. Only Round Oak Rag Apple Elevation, at just over 15%, has had a comparable impact. To put this in perspective, nearly 15% of the genetic material in every Holstein cow alive today comes from this single bull born in 1962.
Well, I can't wait to dig into this story. Let's start at the beginning with the visionary breeder who set everything in motion.
The story of Chief begins with a remarkable man named Lester Fishler. Born near Morse Bluffs, Nebraska in 1911, Fishler overcame significant early hardship, losing his father at age 8 and his mother just 3 years later. Despite these challenges, he developed an extraordinary understanding of Holstein genetics that industry experts would later describe as wizardry.
Tell us more about Fishler's breeding program. What made his approach so special?
Fishler operated his Pawnee Farm on the southern edge of Central City, Nebraska, practically within the city limits. He proudly maintained what he called a strictly rag apple herd. His journey with registered Holsteins began relatively late in 1950, prompted by his children's interest in Future Farmers of America and 4-H work.
That's relatively late to start with registered cattle, isn't it?
Yes, but Fishler made up for lost time quickly. That same year, he purchased a 2-day-old bull calf at the T.A. Burgesson dispersal and brought him home in a pickup truck, a journey of some 400 miles. This bull, Tabor Sovereign Man-O-War, a grandson of Montvic Rag Apple Sovereign, would become his first major herd sire.
So he started with quality genetics right from the beginning.
Exactly. And Man-O-War proved exceptional as a breeding bull, producing a show-winning get of sire that included Pawnee Farm Man-O-War Arlinda, who became a Nebraska state production champion. This success motivated Fishler to begin making strategic trips to Canada, crossing the border every 2 years, searching for exceptional genetics.
I know the Canadian Holstein influence was significant in American breeding programs during this era. Who were some of the breeders Fishler worked with?
He eventually bought bulls from several prominent Canadian breeders, including J.J.E. McCaig, Fred Snyder, and Steve Roman. But the pivotal acquisition came in 1956, when Fishler secured Glenvue Clipper from Doug Dunton's renowned Glenvue farm in Ontario. He also purchased Rosafe Pearl Hannibal at Hector Astengo's 1957 reduction sale, which further strengthened his herd's Canadian influence.
Tell us more about Doug Dunton. I understand he was quite influential in Holstein breeding.
Doug Dunton was truly a giant in Holstein breeding history. Dave Morrow of Holstein Friesian World magazine described him as Canada's greatest breeder of brood cows, though many considered that too limiting and called him the greatest breeder of transmitting dams in the history of the Holstein breed. His Glenvue farm produced animals that appear close up in the pedigrees of both Chief and Elevation, the two bulls that would reshape the Holstein breed.
And this Glenvue Clipper became important in Chief's story.
Critically important. Clipper was a massive white bull with good legs and a square rump, sired by Rosafe Prefect and Inca Supreme Reflection's son. Though Clipper would later be sent to slaughter after his breeding career, weighing an astounding 2,880 pounds at the abattoir, his genetic contribution was already sealed through one remarkable daughter, Pawnee Farm Glenvue Beauty, who would become Chief's dam.
That's an enormous bull, over 2,800 pounds.
Yes, and interestingly, Clipper's daughters were known for their beautiful rumps, tremendous size, and respectable udders, but were low testers for butterfat content. In fact, the article mentions that none of the AI studs were interested in him for this reason. Sometimes the most influential genetics come from unexpected places.
So let's talk about the pivotal moment in this story, the auction that changed dairy history. What happened?
On April 14th, 1962, close to the village of Central City, Nebraska, potential Holstein buyers from 7 different states gathered for the Pawnee Farm dispersal sale. This was no ordinary auction. It represented one of the most significant moments in Holstein breeding history, though few realized it at the time.
Was it a particularly successful sale?
Indeed. The sale average turned out to be the second highest so far that year, reflecting the exceptional quality of Fishler's herd. Among the highlights, Pawnee Farm Royal Master, a yearling bull by Carnation Royal Master, sold for $3,000 to John Blank from Kansas. Pawnee Farm Man-O-War, Arlene, an 8-year-old cow and dam of Royal Master, sold for $2,100.
But I'm guessing the star of the show was Pawnee Farm Glenvue Beauty.
Absolutely. Beauty was 4 years and 7 months old at the time and very pregnant with the calf that would become Chief. Her photograph in the sale catalog had drawn significant attention from breeders across the country.
And this is where the California dairyman enters the story, right?
Yes. Wally Linskog was specifically seeking a successor for his herd sire, Ideal Burke Elsie Leader, who sired show type, dairiness, and rump width, but not enough stature. Linskog was concerned that the trend toward a more dairy-type cow had resulted in breed frailty, so he was specifically seeking a bull mother with front-end width combined with a broad, clean rump, characteristics he saw in Beauty's photo.
So what happened at the auction?
Linskog dispatched his farm manager Merlin Carlson to Nebraska with instructions to purchase Beauty. After fierce bidding between Cash Botma and Carlson, Beauty sold for $4,300, a substantial sum in 1962 that would prove to be perhaps the most consequential investment in dairy genetics history.
$4,300 was a lot of money in 1962. That's the equivalent of about $40,000 today.
Absolutely. And then Beauty had to travel all the way to California, a journey spanning 1,152 miles by train to Turlock, California. And just 25 days after her sale on May 9th, 1962, she gave birth to Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief.
So now we have this special calf born in California. Tell us about Chief's early life.
Chief's pedigree reflected Fishler's meticulous breeding strategy. Both his sire, Reflection Admiral, and dam, Glenvue Beauty, were second-generation descendants of Tour Sovereign Man-O-War, the bull that had laid the foundation for Fishler's herd.
But Fishler never got to see what his breeding program produced in Chief, did he?
That's one of the sad parts of this story. Fishler passed away on September 30th, 1964, just as Chief's first calves were being born. He never witnessed the extraordinary impact his breeding decisions would have on the Holstein breed.
How did Chief get his name? Was there a story behind that?
Yes, there's a wonderful anecdote about that. The naming of Chief came through a fortuitous visit by Dave Risling, head of the dairy department at Modesto Junior College and a Native American active in national Native affairs. When Risling visited Arlinda Farms with his class and asked what the calf would be named, Linskog replied simply, "We'll name him after you, Chief."
That's a great story, but I understand Chief almost didn't survive to fulfill his destiny.
That's right. At 8 months of age, Chief battled a severe case of bloat that nearly claimed his life. This was truly a dramatic moment that could have dramatically altered dairy breeding history had it gone differently. Fortunately, he recovered and developed into a deep-bodied bull with substantial bone and what would later become his trademark characteristic, a ravenous appetite that he would famously pass to his daughters.
It's amazing to think how close we came to losing this influential bull before he ever had a chance to make his mark.
Indeed, the history of dairy cattle breeding is filled with these pivotal moments where things could have gone very differently.
So Chief survived his health scare and grew to maturity. When did people start to recognize his exceptional genetic potential?
Almost immediately. Joe Silva, Lindskoog's herdsman, was so impressed by the production of Chief's first 4 daughters that he declared to his employer, "We've got here one of the great milk bulls of all time." This assessment proved remarkably prescient. Within just 2 years, dairy industry computers had verified Silva's prediction, with Chief achieving a predicted difference of plus 2,000 pounds of milk.
Wow, plus 2,000 pounds was exceptional for that era, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The artificial insemination industry quickly took notice. Morris Ewing, sire analyst with Curtis Breeding Service, carefully tracked Chief's results, while Doug Wilson at American Breeders' Service immediately began using Chief and his daughters for contract matings.
When did Chief enter AI service?
After extended negotiations with Lindskoog, Curtis Breeding Service manager Mel Kenley finally made the decision to acquire Chief. During their discussions, Kenley reviewed a current summary on 24 tested Chief daughters that showed 23,028 pounds milk and 816 pounds fat, with a predicted difference of plus 1,845 milk and plus 70 fat. The daughters were also pleasing for type, showing a difference from expectancy of plus 2.25.
Those are impressive numbers. What was Kenley's reaction?
Recognizing the historic opportunity, Kenley remarked, "Curtis has made money every time we have dealt with Arlinda. I'm ready to sign." In 1968, Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief joined the Curtis battery on a lease arrangement. At his new home in Cary, Illinois, he shared top billing with Paclamar Astronaut.
And how did his first official proof turn out?
Chief's September 1971 official summary, which included his first AI daughters, confirmed his exceptional status with figures of plus 1,982 milk, plus 79 fat, and plus 0.61 predicted difference for type, solidifying his position as one of the top milk bulls in breed history.
Let's talk about these Chief daughters. I understand they had very distinctive characteristics.
They absolutely did. Chief's daughters were instantly recognizable in dairy herds. Wide front-ended cows with deep ribs, correct feet and legs, and most importantly, an extraordinary will to milk. Industry professionals noted that when evaluating a group of cows, the Chief daughters stood out immediately, not just for their physical characteristics, but for their remarkable production capabilities.
Were there any particularly famous Chief daughters?
Yes, Beecher Arlinda Ellen exemplified the production potential Chief passed to his offspring. At 5 years of age, she completed a record of 55,661 pounds of milk, making her the first cow in the breed to produce over 55,000 pounds in a year and the U.S. national champion. This achievement vividly illustrated the revolutionary genetic potential that Chief transmitted.
That's an incredible production record, especially for that era.
And there's a charming anecdote about Ellen that perfectly illustrates the Chief daughter's famous appetite for production. When Lindskoog brought a special flower-decorated blanket to place across Ellen's shoulders during a celebration of her record at the Beecher family farm in Indiana, she immediately began eating the flowers. This prompted an excited Lindskoog to proclaim, "The Chiefs are always hungry."
Yeah, that's priceless. Always hungry for production, and apparently for flowers, too.
Exactly. But not everyone recognized the value of Chief's daughters immediately. At the National Convention in 1969, held in California, one visitor referred to Arlinda Chief Linda as that big white brute and predicted she wouldn't last long. Having reached 12 years of age and produced 211,000 pounds of milk in her lifetime, Linda proved that skeptic decisively wrong.
It's interesting how sometimes the most productive animals don't always fit the ideal type that people expect.
That's very true. And like all bulls, Chief wasn't perfect. His daughters sometimes lacked angularity as heifers, though this typically improved after calving. And their udders could be problematic, sometimes poorly shaped and weakly attached, with more swelling than average that persisted longer. Yet these shortcomings were typically overlooked because of their extraordinary milk production capabilities.
What did industry experts identify as Chief's key strengths?
Pete Blodgett, a sire analyst at Landmark Sires, identified Chief's key strengths as pounds of milk, fat percentage, pounds of fat, width and depth, the correct combination of dairiness and strength, and feet and legs. Blodgett further pointed out that Chief offered the ideal outcross for the Burke and Ormsby bloodlines dominant at that time.
You mentioned earlier that Chief's maternal grandfather came from Doug Dunton's Glenvue farm in Canada. Can you tell us more about this Canadian connection?
Chief's extraordinary genetic potential didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the result of generations of thoughtful breeding, particularly through the Canadian connection established by Lester Fishler. Doug Dunton was himself a legendary breeder, described by Dave Morrow of Holstein Friesian World magazine as Canada's greatest breeder of brood cows. Though many considered him the greatest breeder of transmitting dams in the history of the Holstein breed.
That's quite a reputation. How extensive was Dunton's influence?
The late Dave Morrow once wrote that all present-day Holsteins can be traced to a Glenvue animal, showing the extraordinary reach of Dunton's breeding program. The Glenvue influence was first felt in the Holstein industry during the 1950s and 60s, with the advent of ABC Reflection Sovereign and Spring Farm Fond Hope.
And this Glenvue influence continued through Chief?
Absolutely. This influence continued unabated through the partial Americanization of the Canadian breed, when breed-changing sires like Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief and Round Oak Rag Apple Elevation rose to prominence. Doug Dunton was among that elite group of breeders whose animals appear close up in the pedigrees of both these influential bulls.
So both of the most influential Holstein bulls of all time, Chief and Elevation, can trace their pedigrees back to Glenvue Farm. That's remarkable.
It truly is. And as the 20th century concluded, the Glenvue blood was still prominent in the Holstein breed. 3 North American cow families, which in the 1990s were consistently producing bulls for AI service, were all influenced by Chief's lineage. The Delius of Regan Crest Farms in Iowa, the Martha family of Rice Crest in Pennsylvania, and the tribe of black and white cattle at Comester Farm in Quebec that descended from Elisa Anthony Lee.
Let's talk about how Chief's influence expanded through his sons. Who were some of his most influential male offspring?
Chief's influence expanded exponentially through his exceptional sons, who themselves became breed-changing sires. His most influential sons included Walkway Chief Mark, SWD Valiant, Glendale Arlinda Chief, and Milu Betty Ivanhoe Chief. Each transmitted different aspects of their sire's genetic package.
How did these sons differ in what they transmitted?
There was remarkable variation. Walkway Chief Mark excelled in udders and production, but left questionable legs. SWD Valiant could produce show-ring type, but had weaknesses in udder conformation. One of the most influential Chief's sons was Glendale Arlinda Chief, the maternal grandsire of Emprise Belle Elton and Ronnie Brook Prelude.
So Chief's sons created their own genetic dynasties.
Exactly. For example, Glendale also sired Arlinda Rotate. Arlinda Chief Rose, Rotate's dam, was likewise a chief offspring. Rotate, an extreme milk transmitter who needed protection on udders, was the sire of Arlinda Melwood, in turn the sire of Maysfield Bellwood, whose son, Marathon B.W. Marshall, completed one of the strongest paternal lines of production sires that the breed has known.
That's an incredible genetic chain, spanning multiple generations.
And the influence continued through successive generations, creating some of North America's most influential cow families. The Delia family at Regan Crest Farms in Iowa descended from a Walkway Chief Mark daughter, and the Martha family of Rice Crest in Pennsylvania became 2 of North America's most influential cow families, regularly producing sons for AI service.
let's talk about something truly remarkable: Chief's genetic contribution to today's Holstein population. What do we know about this?
According to the 2020 Holstein pedigree analysis, Chief's genetic influence exceeded that of any other sire except Elevation, which stands at 15.28%. Chief's contribution is estimated at 14.95% of the Holstein genome. To put this in perspective, almost 15% of the genetic material in every Holstein cow alive today traces back to this single bull.
That's absolutely staggering. Nearly 15% from just one bull. Has there ever been anything comparable in other livestock species?
This level of genetic concentration is truly unprecedented in livestock breeding. It creates a challenging paradox for modern breeders. Chief's genetics revolutionized milk production capabilities, adding billions of dollars in value to the dairy industry through increased efficiency. However, the concentration of his genes throughout the breed requires careful management to preserve genetic diversity.
So there's a downside to this remarkable success story.
It's a double-edged sword. Today, the typical Holstein cow produces more than twice the milk volume of cows from the 1960s, with Chief's genetics playing a significant role in this transformation. However, as breeders and geneticists have come to recognize, maintaining genetic diversity is essential for long-term population health.
How are modern breeding programs addressing this challenge?
Modern breeding programs now employ sophisticated genomic testing and more balanced selection approaches that focus not just on production, but also on health, fertility, longevity, and genetic diversity. The goal is to maintain the production gains achieved through Chief's genetics while ensuring sufficient genetic diversity for future generations.
I understand there was another significant development in the Chief story that wasn't discovered until decades after his death. A genetic mutation. Can you tell us about that?
In the early 2000s, researchers made a startling discovery while investigating fertility problems in Holsteins. Using new genomic technology, they identified a lethal recessive mutation called Holstein haplotype 1, or HH1, on chromosome 5. Through meticulous genetic detective work, they traced this mutation back to one bull, Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief.
What exactly does this mutation do?
It's what geneticists call a nonsense mutation that disrupts an essential gene called APAF1, which is involved in programmed cell death, a critical process in embryonic development. When an embryo inherits 2 copies of this mutation, one from each parent, it typically dies around 40 days of gestation, appearing as early embryonic loss or conception difficulties.
But this wasn't noticed during Chief's lifetime.
No, and there's a good reason for that. Like many genetic recessives, the mutation only causes problems when an animal inherits copies from both parents. Chief himself only had 1 copy. He was a carrier. His daughters were all carriers too, but they showed no ill effects. The problems only arose when Chief's descendants were bred to each other, which became increasingly common as his genetics spread throughout the breed.
How significant has the impact of this mutation been?
The economic toll has been substantial. Industry estimates suggest the APAF1 mutation may have been responsible for approximately 500,000 spontaneous abortions over the years, representing approximately $420 million in economic losses to dairy producers worldwide.
That's a significant downside to Chief's otherwise revolutionary impact on milk production.
It's a perfect example of the unintended consequences that can come with genetic selection, focused primarily on a single trait like milk production. While Chief's genetics added billions in value through increased productivity, this hidden cost wasn't discovered until genomic tools became available decades later.
How does the industry manage this mutation today?
Thanks to genomic testing, we can now identify carriers of the HH1 mutation. This allows breeders to make informed mating decisions to avoid breeding carrier to carrier, which would risk embryonic loss. It's a perfect example of how modern technology helps us manage genetic conditions while still taking advantage of valuable genetics for production traits.
So this discovery really underscores the importance of genetic diversity and balanced breeding objectives.
Absolutely. Chief's story, both his revolutionary production impact and this unforeseen genetic complication teaches us valuable lessons about the need for breadth in our breeding goals and the importance of maintaining genetic diversity.
And speaking of genomics, I'm curious, how might Chief's story have been different if he'd been born in the genomic era rather than 1962?
That's a fascinating question. Modern genomic testing, which allows breeders to identify specific genetic markers associated with desirable traits, could have amplified Chief's extraordinary strengths while potentially mitigating his weaknesses.
Curious, would his exceptional genetics have been identified sooner?
Almost certainly. According to recent research on genomic selection effectiveness, the reliability of genomic estimated breeding values shows significant improvement over traditional methods, particularly for young bulls without progeny records, increasing accuracy by approximately 17% for milk yield traits compared to conventional evaluations.
So Chief might have been identified as exceptional even earlier in his life.
Yes, this might have meant Chief's exceptional production potential would have been identified even earlier and with greater precision, potentially accelerating his influence on the Holstein breed.
What about his weaknesses, like the udder conformation issues in his daughters?
That's where genomics could have made a significant difference. Research reveals that poor udder and teat conformation has been reported to reduce profitability in dairy herds and impacts the incidence of mastitis at calving and leads to decreased productivity. Genomic tools could have allowed breeders to make more strategic mating decisions, pairing Chief with cows specifically selected to complement his udder conformation weaknesses while maximizing his production strengths.
And what about the APAF1 mutation we just discussed? Would genomics have identified that?
That's perhaps the most significant difference. Today's genomic testing would have identified Chief as a carrier of the lethal recessive mutation long before it became widespread in the population. Breeders could have still used his exceptional genetics for production while carefully managing matings to avoid the negative consequences of the mutation.
And what about the genetic concentration issue? Could genomics have helped there?
Perhaps most significantly, genomic tools might have prevented some of the challenges associated with extreme genetic concentration. With Chief's genetics ultimately contributing nearly 15% to the Holstein genome, modern genomic approaches might have identified other complementary bloodlines earlier. This could have enabled a more balanced distribution of genetic influence while still capturing Chief's revolutionary production capabilities.
See, so Chief would still have been influential, but perhaps in a more targeted, strategic way.
Exactly. The integration of genomic and phenotypic evaluation shows great promise in enhancing the accuracy of predicting udder-related traits and improving dairy cattle selection. For a bull of Chief's caliber, this combined approach might have resulted in a more targeted deployment of his genetics, balancing immediate production gains with long-term genetic diversity.
Let's talk about the comparison between Chief and Round Oak Rag Apple Elevation. These two bulls together fundamentally reshaped Holstein genetics, didn't they?
Absolutely. While Chief was born in 1962, Elevation came along just 3 years later in 1965. Together, they account for nearly 30% of the genetic makeup of today's Holstein population, with Elevation contributing 15% and Chief at 14.95%.
How did their strengths and weaknesses compare?
They were remarkably complementary. Chief's primary strength was milk production, while Elevation excelled in type improvement. Chief transmitted deep bodies, wide fronts, and extraordinary milk volume, while Elevation passed along dairy strength, frame improvement, and superior udders.
So their weaknesses complemented each other too.
Exactly. Chief's notable weakness was udder conformation issues, while Elevation's was less extreme production. Together, they created the foundation for the modern Holstein cow, one that could both produce at high levels while maintaining the physical structure to support that production.
So, Chief daughters might have had production but udder issues, while Elevation provided the udder improvements but less extreme production.
That's right. Chief's get were known for wide front ends, deep ribs, and tremendous production, yet sometimes struggled with udder attachments. Elevation's superior udder traits and overall conformation strength perfectly complemented Chief's production power.
So, modern breeding programs are essentially trying to balance these traits, the productivity that Chief made possible with the structural soundness elevation provided.
Exactly. The combination of these bloodlines became the foundation for virtually every significant Holstein sire line of the late 20th century. Modern breeding programs continue to balance these traits, seeking to combine the best of both worlds.
How do today's top Holstein sires compare to Chief? Has breeding philosophy changed significantly since his era?
Today's elite Holstein sires reflect a much more balanced approach to breeding than we saw in Chief's time. Take, for example, modern bulls like Stanton's Chief, who traces base to Chief 8 different ways. While these bulls still offer strong production potential, they also excel in health traits, fertility, feed efficiency, and conformation.
So modern bulls are more well-rounded.
Exactly. While Chief excelled tremendously in production but had weaknesses in areas like udder conformation, today's top sires aim for more balance across all traits. This reflects a fundamental shift in breeding philosophy, from maximizing a single trait like milk production to creating a more balanced, sustainable cow that remains productive and healthy throughout a long life.
Has genomic selection accelerated this change?
Absolutely. Genomic selection has allowed breeders to identify bulls that excel across multiple traits simultaneously. In the pre-genomic era, breeders often had to wait years to discover a bull's weaknesses, by which time his genetics might already be widespread. Today, we can identify strengths and weaknesses much earlier, allowing for more strategic breeding decisions.
Are there any other major differences in how the industry approaches breeding today compared to Chief's era?
Another significant difference is our attention to inbreeding and genetic diversity. In Chief's era, there was less concern about genetic concentration. Today, mating programs routinely consider inbreeding coefficients and seek to maintain genetic diversity while still improving productive traits. This more holistic approach is directly informed by lessons learned from Chief's extraordinary but highly concentrated genetic contribution.
Let's talk about the practical implications of Chief's story. What lessons can today's dairy breeders take from this remarkable chapter in Holstein history?
There are several important takeaways. First, breeders need to balance production with diversity. While selecting for production traits that Chief made famous, they should intentionally incorporate genetic outcrosses to maintain diversity.
And how can modern genomic tools help with this?
That's the second key lesson. Utilize genomic testing. Today's breeders can leverage modern genomic tools to identify the beneficial aspects of Chief's genetics while avoiding excessive inbreeding. This technology also allows us to identify carriers of genetic conditions like the APF1 mutation, helping breeders make more informed mating decisions.
It seems like we need to look beyond just milk production figures, right?
Absolutely. The third takeaway is to consider complete genetic merit. Look beyond production figures to evaluate animals on health traits, longevity, and fertility, areas where some diversity beyond Chief's genetics may be beneficial. The most profitable cow isn't necessarily the highest producer if she has health problems or fertility issues.
Hugh, what about understanding the genetics already present in a herd?
That's crucial. Breeders should understand their herd's genetic makeup, know the percentage of Chief's genetics in their herd, and make mating decisions that complement rather than concentrate these genetics. With genomic testing, it's possible to know exactly what genes each animal carries.
So in many ways, Chief's story is both an inspiration and a cautionary tale.
Exactly. The final takeaway is to learn from history. Study how Chief's genetics transformed the breed to understand both the benefits of strategic breeding and the risks of genetic concentration. His story demonstrates the remarkable power of selective breeding to transform an entire breed and industry, but also reminds us of the responsibility that comes with such power.
And what about the economic side of things? Chief increased productivity, but also had some hidden costs.
That's an excellent point. Chief's genetics added billions in value through increased milk production, But the APAF1 mutation he carried also caused an estimated $420 million in losses through embryonic death. The lesson here is that we need to consider both the benefits and potential costs of intensive selection for any trait.
As we wrap up our discussion, let's talk about why Chief's story remains relevant today, more than 60 years after his birth.
Chief's legacy continues to shape the dairy industry decades after his passing. The combination of traits he passed to his offspring, especially their remarkable will to milk with the strength to sustain production at high levels, created a new paradigm for what was possible in dairy production.
How do today's breeding programs balance the gains from Chief's genetics with the need for genetic diversity?
Modern Holstein breeders face an important challenge: how to continue building on the production gains achieved through Chief's genetics while ensuring sufficient genetic diversity for future generations. This balance requires thoughtful selection decisions that consider not just production traits, but overall genetic health of the population.
And are there specific breeding strategies that help with this balance?
Yes, many breeding programs now intentionally incorporate outcross genetics, bloodlines with less Chief and elevation influence, to maintain genetic diversity while still focusing on productive traits. Genomic testing allows breeders to be much more precise about this balance than ever before.
It seems like Chief's story gives us perspective on both what's possible through selective breeding and the potential pitfalls.
Exactly. Whether you're breeding for production, type, or a balance of traits, understanding the full impact of Chief's genetics provides valuable perspective on both the potential and responsibility of selective breeding. His story remains one of the most fascinating chapters in livestock improvement, a revolution that continues to evolve with each new generation of Holstein cattle.
So the question for today's breeders isn't whether to use Chief's genetics.
Precisely. The question for today's breeders isn't whether to use Chief's genetics, they're already present in virtually every Holstein, but how to balance their benefits with the maintenance of genetic diversity needed for future generations.
Well, we've covered an incredible amount of ground today, exploring the legacy of Pawnee Farm Arlinda Chief. From his birth in 1962 to his unprecedented genetic contribution to today's Holstein population, Chief's story is truly remarkable. We've learned about Lester Fishler's visionary breeding program, the pivotal $4,300 purchase of Chief's pregnant dam, his extraordinary daughters and influential sons, and even the unexpected discovery of a genetic mutation that affected fertility in the breed.
Chief's story really encapsulates both the power and responsibility of strategic breeding decisions. That $4,300 investment in a pregnant cow yielded billions of dollars in increased milk production worldwide, but it also taught us important lessons about genetic diversity and the need for balanced breeding objectives. The discovery of the APAF1 mutation decades after Chief's death reminds us that our breeding decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond what we initially see.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us through the Bullvine website at www.thebullvine.com or connect with us on social media. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Bullvine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
We'd also encourage you to check out our related articles on the Bullvine website. We have pieces on the Four Nations Cup of Holstein genetics, the ultimate guide to breeding dairy cattle, and the 2024 BAA rankings featuring elite Holstein genetics. You'll find links to these articles in our show notes.
Thanks so much for joining us for this fascinating journey through one of dairy breeding's most influential stories. Until next time, I'm Bella.
And I'm Douglas. Thanks for listening to the Bullvine Podcast.